So with that, Tim, are you on with us at this point? I'm not hearing Tim on here yet.
I am here. Can you hear me, Dan?
There you are. Fantastic. All
Excellent.
right, so we've got Tim's mic working. With that, let me transition. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Tim German from Quibix. And Tim, you're going to talk to us about real-world lessons from Essbase 1221C on-prem deployments. I was very interested to hear about this and what's going on with the on-prem deployments of that, with everything being cloud. So with that, let me turn things over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to ANDOUC for having me today. Good afternoon, good morning. No, afternoon for everyone now, I think, well, at least for me. And yeah, as Dan said, I'm going to talk about what I've been doing and what I've learned from doing Essbase 21C on-prem deployments, and just share my story of doing that over the last 6 months or so. Personally, I've always felt like my focus has been using the Oracle products to build systems, working with users and clients to build systems that solve problems, and that this sort of infrastructure and installation and configuration side is really kind of a necessary evil. But I want to encourage other Essbase practitioners that if I can do this, this is something that you can take on as well. We've done it successfully. Other Essbase practitioners can take this on. I noticed there are a few people on this call on the Zoom that I know have also done this and quite possibly know more about doing this than I do. So great to get their feedback as well. If you've seen the same problems I'm going to talk about solved, or solved them in different ways. Okay. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, kind of the road to 21C, like how we got to Essbase 21C, because it's pretty tangled, especially over the last few years. Going to talk about why I'm doing this, or why my clients are doing this, why they've decided to install 21C, and why they've decided to install it on-prem when there are obviously cloud options out there. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we needed to work out first, some of the decisions that had to be made in planning deployment. I'm going to talk about how the deployments went and how the processes went for what are now various clients that have been through this. Some of the things that I wish I knew going into it, so some of the problems that we encountered and how we solved them, and things that I will know going into my next set of these projects. And then what's next, both for practitioners who I think need to know about this stuff, and also for clients and what the future holds. All right, so this is a little diagram of what's happened to the Essbase product over the last 6 or so years. And it's pretty complicated and pretty confusing, I think. And I think Oracle have acknowledged that as well, to their credit, that it's been, the direction of the product has been a little bit tangled. Essbase itself has been around for an extremely long time, like 30 years, which is a very long time for a product of this type. But back in 2016, Oracle released 11.124, and that was a release that they promised would remain in support until, I think, initially the end of 2020, and then they relented and said the end of 2021. But the message was that things were moving to the cloud. And in 2017, in spring of 2017, Essbase arrived in the cloud in the form of Essbase as a component of Oracle Analytics Cloud, a platform as a service product. That itself went through a couple of iterations. It started out with a very heavily customer managed version in OAC, and then morphed into Oracle Autonomous Analytics Cloud, Essbase, which was more Oracle managed. But then Oracle moved back away from that to a more customer managed product again in the form of Essbase 19C, which is deployed through the Oracle Cloud Marketplace onto Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And that's much more of an IaaS product, an infrastructure as a service product, where you now have your hands on the box on which Essbase is running, even though it's in Oracle's data center and was deployed by an Oracle process. You can SSH onto the box and pull all the levers and so on. At the same time as that, in the same year as that came out, Oracle also released 11.2 for on-prem, and that was slated as the terminal release of 11x for EPM and Essbase, with support guaranteed, Premier support guaranteed through 2030. So that was kind of that seemed at the time like that was going to be where the on-prem diehards were going to stop. You're going to have to go to 11.2, and that was going to keep you going for 10 years or so. But then in 2020, Oracle decided that they were actually going to port the cloud code line, or make the cloud code line available on-prem. And in 2020, they released Essbase 21c as a downloadable install for Linux. It actually came to Linux down as an on-prem install before 21c was released on Oracle Cloud via the Cloud Marketplace again. And then in December of 2021, Essbase 21c for Windows as an install, as a downloadable install came out. So it's been a really confusing picture of whether Oracle's kind of path forward was on the cloud or was going to be on-prem, and we had these different competing versions. And the good news is that we now have one single code line, whether you're in the cloud or you're on-prem. You've got 21c. It's almost functionally identical between cloud and on-prem. That's where the development effort's going to be focused in the future. It's eventually going to underlie the EPM product as well, if it doesn't already. It's already certified as the database underneath 11.2. And so the path forward now seems much, much clearer for this product. So why am I doing this, or why are my customers doing this? Because I'm doing it because my customers pay me to, and that's what they want to do. Well, they're going for an independent deployment, and an independent deployment is Oracle's terminology for downloadable install, basically. Sort of means the same thing as on-prem, although on-prem doesn't necessarily mean truly on-prem. It could mean installing to another cloud host. But not every customer wants to go to cloud, or wants to go to cloud right now. And even if they do want to go to cloud, not every company wants to go to the Oracle cloud. There are customers out there that have big investments in managing and running their products on other cloud providers like AWS, for example. And so customers might decide, well, we're not going to use the marketplace version of Essbase 21c. We're going to download it, and we're going to either install it in our data center, we're going to install it in our cloud host. Another reason customers, and this definitely holds true for a couple of my customers, want to do an independent deployment on-prem right now, is just that true cloud migration is too big a project for them to take on right at this moment. The integration and security and networking concerns that go with a move to cloud just make that project a larger proposition than simply upgrading to 21c where the software is currently installed. One thing that is not driving people to do the independent deployment is licensing costs. The way that Essbase in the 21c in the cloud is licensed, there are very few situations where you would be spending significantly more to run it in the cloud than you are paying, say, for maintenance on your existing on-prem licenses. I think that only really becomes a concern if you need to run an estate in the cloud at the same time as maintaining your on-prem licenses, because you can't move all at once, for example. That's really, generally speaking, the pricing of the cloud options is very competitive. And why are they going to 21c in particular? Well, there's a lot of support-related reasons for that. The big one being that staying put for customers that are currently on 11.124 is just not supported. Or rather, it's not in Premier support. Premier support means that you can get fixes. There'll be certification for new third-party products like versions of Office or Windows server operating systems, browsers, and so on. None of that exists once Premier support ends. So if you run into a bug, you still have support. You can still log into support.oracle.com. You can still call Oracle up. You can still ask for help. They'll still try and help you. But if you encounter a problem that would require a bug fix to resolve, for example, Oracle are not going to do that. there's not going to be any new code for 11.124. There is another on-prem option in that there's 11.2, which is supported with Premier support through 2030, but that's only available for EPM customers. It's an EPM only release, which means that if you're an Essbase only shop, you don't have planning or one of the other EPM products with Essbase, you're not technically eligible to use 11.2. Net new customers are probably not going to be doing this. They're probably not going to be doing an independent deployment of 21C. It probably makes sense for a net new customer to go to 21C in the cloud, unless you have some really major compliance or regulatory concern around Oracle hosting, or you're really strongly wedded to another cloud infrastructure provider. Then in addition to the support considerations, there are a bunch of functional reasons in terms of new features and enhancements that only exist in 21C. This is not an exhaustive list. I've picked out 4 or 5 that I think are significant, but there are a lot of new features and enhancements in 21C that will probably never come to any patch in 11.2 or earlier versions. I think probably the biggest one is hybrid mode. This could kind of be its own presentation, but hybrid mode essentially brings together the rich calculation language of Essbase BSO, block storage option, and combines it with the scalability and query performance without requiring pre-aggregation, lengthy pre-aggregation that ASO cubes have, aggregate storage option cubes have. And hybrid brings those two things together to kind of give you the best of both worlds. It's implemented by just making your parent members in sparse dimensions dynamic and setting some configuration properties. It's very easy to set up, turn on. And it results in a cube that has all the features and functions of block storage, but with almost zero calculation time potentially, or much reduced calculation time. And hybrid has been around for quite a while, since I think 2014 in 11.123.500. But the functional coverage has expanded, and in 21C is almost complete functional coverage. So that means all BSO calculation functions, or very nearly all BSO calculation functions, can now take advantage of hybrid. And that was definitely not the case in previous versions, not the case in 11.124. So if you want to take full advantage of hybrid, you really need to be on 21C. There are some other enhancements to hybrid in 21C, as well as functional coverage. There's better dependency analysis, which means it just calculates how to answer queries more efficiently. It performs better. That means it's more scalable, where before hybrid would kind of run out of steam with a certain size of cube, and some of those limits are being lifted. And there are also new tools provided via the Cube Designer plugin to help customers and implementers design hybrid cubes that are efficient. Hybrid is a huge reason to use 21C. Some other features that I think are notable in 21C, shadow cubes. This is something that a lot of customers have built manually, a lot of Essbase users have built manually, where you have your users accessing a live cube. They're querying data, submitting data or whatever, and working in one cube. Now you have to update your cube. You don't want to take it offline while that's happening. So instead, you update a second copy of the cube. You run your loads and batch processes and calculations and so on that second copy. And only when the second copy is ready to go do you switch them around. Well, that's something that's been kind of hacked together manually by, as I said, lots of customers, but that's now built into the product as a feature very slickly, and it can be automated through the REST API. Last couple of 21C features, we have the Cube Designer, an Excel plugin that allows you to develop Essbase cubes offline. It includes optimization utilities now. These are all relatively new. It can perform data distribution analysis for optimization. It can help optimize solve order. It can help with sizing of calculator caches and so on. These are all 21C features. Sandboxes, workflow. So 21C has a very efficient sandbox functionality. It lets you take a copy of a slice of data that's your personal copy, but it's done very efficiently. It doesn't copy the entire slice of data. It just copies and stores the delta. So if you want to take a copy of your data for fiscal 22, and then you want to change the sales of just a couple of products and see what effect that has on your gross margin, for example, the Sandbox will only store the couple of products that you changed. But when you query the data, it looks to you like you've got a full set of data there that you're modifying as you wish. And then there's workflow, where you can then reincorporate that, or have a user reincorporate their changed data back into the main cut of your data, but only with approvals. So it's possible to build kind of planning light applications that really compete a little bit with Hyperion Planning. Doesn't have the full form-based functionality of planning and so on, but as far as workflow and approvals goes, there's definitely a little bit of overlap there. We also have modern interfaces. We don't have to depend on EAS anymore and downloading a Java applet and so on. Everything about 21C is exposed in the browser pretty much. And then last functional item, and this is what I think is one of the most interesting ones, is that we have a really good REST API. And it's really good because it's full coverage. In the past, there have been a lot of different ways to automate Essbase, but there were always certain things that you couldn't do. I think with any API, even the Java API, which probably has the best coverage of all the automation methods available for Essbase. So we can do things like directly edit an outline. We can say just add a member. There's no opening an outline, making changes to it, saving it back. We can just make a REST API call, add a member to a queue without running load rules or anything like that. We can monitor and submit jobs to do things like run aggregation scripts and load data, or perform LCM extracts, or all of these kind of things can be done through the REST API. You can control and configure that Sandbox workflow through the REST API. You can manage security. You can manipulate the configuration of the system. You can configure drill-through reports. And the last item on my list here is the one that I think is most interesting. You can even edit load rules. And that was something you could never do through any API or automation method before. So let's say you have a load rule that contains a find and replace list, or a set of select and reject criteria. You can update those things dynamically. Or if a load rule contains, and this is actually something I'll come to later because it relates to a limitation we ran into in 21C, you can update the SQL query contained within a load rule. And you can do that programmatically. And that was something you could always do through the admin interface before, but it was never possible to automate. So there is a true full coverage API. If you can do it in the admin interface, you can do it through the REST API. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why customers are choosing to go to 21C and choosing to go to 21C on-prem. Now I want to talk about some of the things we had to do to prepare to deploy the product. As far as licensing goes, it's exactly the same as it always used to be. We can have per CPU licenses. We can have named user Essbase licenses. You can also be licensed per Oracle via BI Foundation Suite. You're still entitled to use Essbase. Obviously, to download and install new software, you have to be active, paid up. You have to be paying your maintenance. But again, that's exactly as it always has been. Some prerequisite and compatibility information. So 21C supports Windows Server 2019 or Red Hat / Oracle Linux 7 or 8. Supports Java 1.8, supports all the major current browsers. As a repository database, it needs a relational database repository underneath it, as it always has done. Oracle is much better supported than SQL Server, which I guess is natural. But Oracle 12, 18, 19 supported. For SQL Server right now, the only supported version is 2016 and Service Pack 2. That struck me as really weird when I did a deployment for a customer that is a SQL Server shop. And that's because Service Pack 2, I think, runs out of support itself later this year in October. So presumably, hopefully, there's going to be a patch that addresses that and includes certification of a later service pack of SQL Server 2016 or a later version of SQL Server, or perhaps not even a patch. Perhaps Oracle will simply certify the existing version with a later version of SQL Server. But yeah, SQL Server users are in a slightly odd situation at the moment. There are also, because 21C is deployed as a WebLogic application, there are also some Fusion middleware prerequisites that have to be met. There's a pretty extensive list of packages that need to be installed on Linux. On Windows, most everything is already there in Windows Server 2019, but you do have to be careful with the versions of the Visual C++ redistributables that are installed on Windows. And actually, that's something that I ran into, got bitten by. The installer, I think, checks for the presence of those Visual C++ redistributables, but it doesn't check to ensure that all of the right versions have been installed, and the installation or configuration, I forget which, will fail if the appropriate versions, the documented versions, aren't present, even though you pass the prerequisite checks. There are also a couple of major decision points that have to be made prior to deploying or in the process of planning the deployment, around security and around the admin interface. So Essbase security for on-prem customers prior to 21C was always via EPM Foundation Services, a separate component that managed security for Essbase and the whole EPM suite. Oracle have, I think, a concession to people that are very, very comfortable with those tools, allowed users to continue using Foundation services. You have to have a separate instance of EPM Foundation Services 11.2 installed, as well as 21C. Unless you are using other EPM products that you are managing security for through Foundation Services, I cannot see a good reason to do that. Yes, that may be the most familiar interface for managing security, but there really isn't a very steep learning curve to security in 21C without Foundation Services. And it seems to introduce, having a separate instance of 11.2 with Foundation Services running, it seems to introduce a lot of extra moving parts and potential points of failure, and creates dependency on the certification of a different code line, that you just don't really want to deal with if you're an Essbase shop. So the other options for security are to use native WebLogic security, which is explicitly not recommended by Oracle for production use, or integrate with an external authentication provider via WebLogic. So that's your classic Active Directory integration type scenario. And then similarly, on the admin interface side, Oracle have provided, again, I feel like this is a concession to people that really, really love their existing tool set. They have provided something called EAS Lite, Essbase Administration Services Lite, which is a version of EAS that's packaged up with the new 21C installation. The alternative to using that is to use the new Essbase web interfaces. Again, I feel like it's probably a good idea, unless you have a really strong reason not to use the new interfaces. And something to know about this is that it's not either or. You have to use one or the other. If you decide that you're going to make a cube, that you import a cube and migrate it to 21C, and then decide that you're going to administer it with EAS Lite, you are basically turning that cube into an EAS-like cube that has to be administered through EAS Lite and can no longer be administered fully through the new Essbase web interface. So you kind of set yourself permanently on the EAS Lite path. You can't just use it for a little while, or at least not without having a second migration effort. And when you decide you want to start using the new Essbase web interface. And the new interface is where any new features are going to be exposed. So once you commit to using EAS Lite, there may be new properties and things like that that are never going to be exposed in EAS Lite, and you're stuck administering cubes that way until you rebuild them and recreate the application for use in the Essbase web interface. So in both of those points, in both of these decisions, I personally would encourage clients to go with the modern options unless they have a really strong reason to stick with either Foundation or EAS. Okay, so having kind of met the prerequisites and made those decisions and so on, just going to talk about how the actual installations went. Installing configuration processes have gone so far in my experience. I find the documentation for independent deployments is really good, in my opinion. You sometimes have to follow the breadcrumbs a little bit. What I mean by that is that, especially around prerequisites and so on, because Essbase is deployed as a WebLogic application, sometimes you'll get redirected to Fusion middleware prerequisites, for example, and you do have to follow that path all the way down and make sure you met all the prerequisites before you start deploying. The software download itself is super easy, really easy compared to the old 11124 type process. There's a little screenshot here that you can see on this slide. There are literally 2 files to download for the full deployment of Essbase. There's the Fusion middleware infrastructure .jar file, and there's the Essbase 21.3.jar file. 2 fairly large files. You just download the 2 of them. It's not like the old days where you had all these different packages, the V numbers with 6 digits, and there's probably 10 packages required to be downloaded to do a full Essbase deployment, because it had lots of different services built into it, or required for it, rather. Actually running the installation and configuration is also pretty straightforward. There are graphical installers for both Fusion middleware infrastructure and for 21C itself. So to deploy Fusion middleware, you run the Fusion middleware Java package. It pops up this graphical installer. If you're on Linux, you need a X Windows set up to display the graphical deployment interface. Most of this is self-explanatory. There's nothing really tricky in this. You run the Fusion middleware Java package, then you run the Essbase Java package. Again, it's mostly self-explanatory. You might have to choose ports, things like that, whether you're going to run in TLS mode, so SSL mode, which in production almost everybody would now. You can choose at that point whether you're going to deploy EAS Lite, for example, or not. You can choose whether you're going to be in EPM Foundation Services security mode or not. But it's all fairly self-explanatory and well documented. These were not the tricky parts of the process. Very similarly to in the old days, after you run your installation, there's then a configuration utility you have to run. And this takes you through doing things like creating repository schemas. And this is where it actually deploys and configures the WebLogic applications and deploys the Essbase service, so that after this step, you've actually got a running Essbase server. That's not quite the end of it, though. There are some post-configuration tasks that you have to go through. For example, integrating with external authentication via the WebLogic console. So this is not something you do in Essbase itself, it's something you do in the WebLogic console. And that's a separate process you do afterwards. When you first deploy the process, you just have one native admin user that you created during configuration, and you've got to kind of externalize authentication. Conceptually very similar to what you would have to do in Foundation services as well, where you deploy it first and then you go and set up an external authentication provider afterwards. Certificate deployment, if you're using secure mode, which almost everybody will be now in production, that's also entirely done via WebLogic, but that has to be done after the deployment configuration. The documentation for both of these things is incorporated in the Essbase documentation, although they're processes you do in the WebLogic console. The documentation and the flow is included in the Essbase deployment instructions, which I appreciated. It didn't throw you out to the Fusion middleware documentation to follow these particular bits. And These tasks, I think integration with external authentication was pleasantly smooth. Certificate deployment is a little tricky. There is good documentation, but when things don't quite seem to work, I'm not really an expert, and I don't on these things, and I don't speak the language of key stores and identity stores and trust certificates and all that kind of stuff. I'm lucky to have other members of my team at Quibix who do know these things. Yeah, the documentation is there, and if everything works first time, you're in good shape. If not, can get a little bit tricky there. Migration was pretty straightforward, especially for applications. There are several ways of doing it, that Oracle do a good job of documenting. One way to export applications and then import them into a new environment is to use the DBX export utility that creates those Cube Designer format Excel workbooks that contain the structure of the database, calc scripts, all of those things, and then import those DBX workbooks. I started out using that. I don't particularly recommend it. LCM, I think, actually has better coverage of things like filters and things like that. And LCM just seemed to work really, really well. I was using DBX kind of through force of habit, working with Cube Designer in the cloud version of the product. But the version of LCM that's bundled up with 21C, and you must use that version, is extremely slick. It worked very, very well for me, moving from 11.124 to 21C. And then once you've created your LCM exports, you can just import them via the web interface in 21C. Also, you can automate it by the Essbase command line interface. One thing to know about using LCM is that the source application must be converted to Unicode mode, or is converted to Unicode mode in the process of running that LCM process. So if you're running this against a production environment, an existing 11.124 production environment, you're going to want to take a copy of the cube and then export the copy, because you don't know exactly what's going to happen if you convert a current production application into Unicode mode. Probably don't want to make that kind of change on a current production application unless you're very confident that you know how that's going to affect things. Data, you can decide for yourself. You can include data in LCM. I just thought, again, force of habit, tend to export data myself, copy it over and import it myself. Security migration is the trickiest part of the migration, and that's because 21C has a slightly different set of application roles to any previous version or to any previous on-prem version. So there isn't a direct one-to-one mapping of security roles in 11.124 to security roles in 21C. Certain things you can still do through Maxell, like you can control, you can grant permissions to run calculations, grant associations to filters, but you can't grant service level roles through Maxell. And so security is somewhere where you're probably going to want to spend some time on analysis and make sure you understand, if you're coming from a previous version, exactly how the new roles line up, and make sure that what you're granting is exactly what you want to grant. That's not 100% straightforward. Everything works, and you can. I'm very confident that you can always accomplish what you want to accomplish in terms of access in 21C, but it's not going to be that's not going to necessarily be a straight migration. There's lots of guidance in the documentation on this, like explaining how those roles line up and so on, but it's going to take some analysis. Automation and backups. Everyone has, pretty much every customer is going to have a bunch of automation scripts hanging around. They're going to have their backup processes that they had from previous versions. On the automation side, existing Maxell scripts work just fine. Very minimal repointing, new server name and so on. Even S command continues to work, which has been deprecated for at least 15 years, I think. But S command continues to work as an automation method against 21C. The REST API, as I said, which I spoke about earlier, is available, but obviously you're not going to have, if you're coming from 11.124, you're not going to have existing REST API code. On On the backup side, Oracle recommend in the documentation that you configure backups now using LCM for individual application backups. If you're already doing that, that will continue to work. If you're not doing that and you're just shutting down applications or shutting down the services and then backing up the folders that contain the cubes, that also still seems to work just fine. I have customers doing that, tested very successfully, moving cubes between environments or just restoring onto the same environment. So LCM seems to be the recommended method from Oracle now, but it's definitely not the only way you can successfully back up applications. One thing to know, especially on the backup side, is that the locations of everything have all changed. Again, this happens with every major technology change. The folder structures and everything are all completely different, and you have to update your backup processes, or you're not going to be picking up what you think you're picking up. There are a few changes for administrators and end users. For administrators, again, everything's shifted around. So there are a lot of new log file locations and new log files themselves. Still have the classic Essbase service log and all the classic individual application logs. But there's now the new Java agent. The old Essbase agent has become the Java agent. That has its own logs. WebLogic has its own logs, obviously. And sometimes when you're trying to troubleshoot a problem, you're going to have to go and dig into WebLogic logs and try and line up events in those logs with events that you're seeing in the Essbase logs. It's all just new and moved around. Something that I think is a big improvement are the new start and stop processes. So there is now just a single stop script and a single start script that get deployed as part of the deployment. What used to be separate services, so in an 11.124 environment, you would have foundation services, you'd have analytic provider services, you'd have Essbase administration services, and then Essbase itself. And all of those things would have to be started up to start the system. They'd have to be started potentially in the right order for things to come up correctly. All of that is done away with. There's just one start script. It starts up the Essbase WebLogic application, and you've got all of those things available. It's quick, simple, has fewer dependencies. I think that's a big improvement in how things are laid out in 21C. And there are also new tools for administration. Obviously, the interface for administration is completely different. All of the same things are there conceptually, but it all just looks different to administration services, and it takes a little while to get used to where things are and finding your way around. For end users that use SmartView, for example, besides having to create a new connection and enter a new connection URL, everything is absolutely transparent. You really couldn't tell as a user whether you're connected to a 21C server or a 11.124 server. That part of the deployments that we've done has just been absolutely seamless. So quickly, just a few of the things that I wish I'd known going into these deployments, or at least going into the first one I did. 21C is the cloud code line brought to on-prem, and I think this is just my my semi-educated guess, but I think the reason the fact that it comes from the cloud means that the service's access to folders outside of its own catalog is limited. Probably as a security measure, you don't want the Essbase end users on a cloud product being able to go and make Essbase do things to the infrastructure that are outside of Essbase's sort of folder structure and Essbase's domain. That means that the database files themselves that contain data and so on are only permitted in the one location. And that's a big change, because in 11.124, you'd be able to use a configuration setting to say, I want to store my data over here, and I want to store my indexes over here, and I want to store my software can be here. You can't do that anymore. All of your application data is going to sit within this path that I've listed out here that ends with /Essbase/app. Oracle guidance is to use operating system mounts if you want those to be physically different drive locations for either high availability reasons or performance reasons or recovery or so on. I also wish I knew that when I externalize security, I was no longer going to be able to log in with my initial native admin user. So after doing a deployment, you just have one user that you created during the deployment. You can log into the front end with it, but you've just got that one user. After externalizing to Active Directory, I think all logins through the Essbase front end now go through Active Directory. And that means that your one native user can no longer log in through the web interface. And the web interface is where you grant any other user, including Active Directory users, access to the system. So it feels like the first time I ran into this, I thought I'd really screwed things up, because I thought I was in this catch-22 situation where I can't log in, but I can't grant anyone else access to log in either. What I found you have to do in this situation is use the REST API, which the native user can still use, to grant one Active Directory user admin privileges. And once you've done that, now you can log into the front end again with that Active Directory user, if that makes sense. There's a little code snippet here showing using curl to use the REST API and that native user to grant one more Active Directory user access. And after that, you're back into the system, and you can carry on and grant access, set up the rest of security and grant access to as many Active Directory users as you like. But I got a little bit of an unpleasant surprise the first time I ran into this. I also wish I knew a lot more about WebLogic administration, still do. This is just for example, I don't share this example because I think this particular problem is going to happen in every deployment, but just as an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. We ran into a problem where if the Active Directory server started responding slowly, there is a pool of Active Directory connections that WebLogic maintains, completely separate to Essbase, and connection requests would pile up. That connection pool would get exhausted, and after that, no one else could log in. And it's not really obvious looking at the Essbase logs what's going on. You can just see that users are failing to get in. You have to dig into the WebLogic logs to find out about it. And then I looked through, when we eventually found the error messages in the WebLogic logs, searched for them in Oracle support and found a solution that involves running the WebLogic scripting tool to change some configuration properties in WebLogic and increase the size of that connection pool. Again, not sharing that because I think everyone's going to encounter the same problem, but Essbase is now running as a WebLogic application, and the documentation is good, the support database is good, but I'm not a WebLogic administrator, and I don't think many Essbase practitioners are. And a WebLogic administrator is a very useful addition to your team if you have one. I have a coworker who, in a former life, was a WebLogic administrator, and he was very helpful in solving some of these really WebLogic side problems that we encountered more quickly than I would have done otherwise. And it wouldn't have been impossible otherwise, but certainly helps to have some expertise there. A few other minor irritations that we encountered, and this is probably not an exhaustive list either, but some of the ones that I kept notes of because they seemed particularly troublesome. You can't run an ASO aggregation script in the web interface. You can run an aggregation process, but if you've got a predefined script that specifies specific aggregate views, you can't run that from the web interface through the job console. You can't use substitution variables in load rules. For one customer, this was actually a pretty big issue. They had a process where they would load data from their fact table, but they only wanted to load data since the last time the cube had been updated, because it was a very large table. Only want to bring in new data. So what they would do to accomplish that in 11.124 was each time they ran a load, they would update a substitution variable to the timestamp of the load, and then they'd use that substitution variable in the where clause of a SQL query that was embedded in the load rule and say, okay, only give me records that are newer than this timestamp. Well, that stopped working because we couldn't put the substitution variable into the load rule. And this is where we actually used the REST API to update the SQL query in the load rule directly. So we kind of ran into a 21C limitation and then used a 21C only feature to resolve it, which was kind of neat, but definitely would have liked to have known about this going in. There are obviously security differences. Just one example, you can't grant the privilege to run all calculations without also granting database manager role. Instead, you have to go into each calculation individually and grant that calculation. Just a difference in the way security works in 21C. And you also can't specify partition user via the web interface. So when you go to create a partition, that partition is going to be created with whatever user you are logged into the web interface as at that time. Whereas previously you could create a user, like for example, a read-only user specifically to be the partition user, and then set up your partitions that way. That's changed, and I think there may actually be a change for that in the very most recent patch, because that was a slightly irritating limitation. Okay, so what's next? For people on this call,
one thing just to let you know, we did have a question or a comment come in. You can use substitution variables and data sources utilizing parameters. It's from Glenn, in case that on the previous slide on this. So you can use substitution variables and data sources utilizing parameters, just in case you wanted to address that.
Cool, thank you, Glenn. I thought if anybody would know better than me on that, it would be Glenn. So
thanks for being
I appreciate
on,
that.
All right, go ahead and wrap up with the what's next.
Yeah, that's a cool alternative way to solve that same problem. Thank you. Yep. Yeah. For practitioners, a cool thing about being back on one code line in 21C is that we can do laptop deployments again. Consultants and people that want to learn the product can deploy the system to their own machines. If you build that on the Linux operating systems, that basically means an all-free stack. Technically, the software is currently only available from eDelivery and not from OTN, and that is significant because the licenses are different from eDelivery and OTN. If you download software from OTN, that's basically an indefinite license, unrestricted for educational training use. eDelivery is technically a 30-day trial. I'm not a lawyer, but that's my understanding of the license difference between software from those two sources. So in theory, I believe that a laptop deployment done now is only allowed as a 30-day trial, and that's between you and Larry. For customers, there's going to be a database upgrade in the near future if you're a SQL Server shop, I think, or at least a patch of Oracle, of Essbase rather. And now you're back on-prem again, so you've got to keep patching. There are lots of patches already for Essbase 21 that you just download in the normal way from support and deploy in the normal way using OPatch. I know I've talked about some of the challenges we faced, obviously, and some particular irritating little problems that we ran into. But overall, we've had a super positive experience. Using the new tools has not been a major challenge, either for us as developers and implementers or for client administrators, client users. Conceptually, the tools do all the same things. You just have to find your way around them to see where features have been left in the interface. There are new features and enhancements coming that are going to be primarily in this code line. So it's great to be on 21C for that reason. EPM is going to be certified with 21C, or is already certified with 21C. And like I said, I've shared some gotchas and challenges in the spirit of saving other people encountering the same problems that I did and struggling with the same problems that we did. But it was all overcome. There are no showstoppers here. And so, yeah, to conclude, the users are happy, customers are happy, projects have been successful. This is very doable. It really works. And this is the way forward for Essbase. 21C is the way forward for Essbase on the cloud or on-prem. I don't know if we had any other questions, Dan.
I think that kind of addresses it, just the clarifying stuff that came up, Tim, but appreciate you presenting. We'll wrap up here, and thanks for sharing about Essbase. Great to have that, additional content in our library. So thank you so much for addressing that.
Thank you.